They say curiosity killed the cat, but in my case, it lured me into the depths of a horror I could have never imagined. I was always a skeptic, someone who laughed at ghost stories and dismissed tales of the supernatural as products of an overactive imaginations. But what happened to me one bleak October weekend has forever altered my perception of reality. It all started with an invitation from my old college friend, Mark. He was an amateur historian with a particular fascination for abandoned places. When he called me one Friday afternoon, his voice brimming with excitement, I knew he had found something interesting. "Dan, you've got to check this out," he said. "I discovered an old mansion deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the city. It's been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. The place is practically untouched." I agreed, more out of boredom than genuine interest. The thought of spending a night in a crumbling mansion seemed like a fun adventure, a break from the monotony of my 9 to 5 routine. We packed our gear, flashlights, sleeping bags, some food and water, and set off early the next morning. The mansion was every bit as eerie as Mark had described. Hidden behind a thick curtain of trees, it loomed like a shadowy behemoth, its windows dark and empty, the front door hanging on rusty hinges. The air around it felt heavy, charged with a sense of foreboding that made my skin prickle. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing in the vast, empty foyer. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the chandeliers like ghostly drapes. Mark was in his element, snapping photos and jotting down notes. I was wandering through the rooms, trying to imagine what the place had looked like in its prime. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found an old diary tucked in a drawer. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Hawthorne, who had lived in the mansion in the early 1900s. As I read the entries, a sense of unease settled over me. October 3rd, 1902. There are whispers in the walls, voices that speak of sorrow and despair. I fear I am losing my mind. October 12th, 1902. Last night I saw her again, the woman in the white dress. She stood at the foot of my bed, her eyes hollow, her face twisted in anguish. What does she want from me? October 20th, 1902. I can no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. The woman is always with me, her presence a constant torment. I fear I will not survive much longer. I shivered and closed the diary. The sun was setting, and the mansion's shadows grew longer, more sinister. I found Mark in the library, surrounded by old books and papers. "Mark, I think we should leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Leave? Are you kidding? We've only just begun," he replied, not looking up from his notes. I tried to argue, but he was adamant. Reluctantly, I agreed to stay the night. We set up our sleeping bags in the grand ballroom, a vast, empty space that felt cavernous in the dark. The night was cold, and every creak and groan of the old mansion seemed amplified in the silence. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint whispering sound. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. Mark was still asleep, oblivious to the noise. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from upstairs. The air grew colder as I ascended the staircase, and the whispering became clearer. It led me to a small, locked door at the end of the narrow hallway. To my surprise, the key was in the lock. I turned it slowly, the old metal groaning in protest, and pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, empty except for a large mirror that covered one wall. The whispers were louder now, almost a chorus, but the room was empty. I approached the mirror, my reflection pale and ghostly in the dim light. As I stared into the glass, the whispering ceased, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, slowly, The surface of the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a breeze. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. A figure emerged from the mirror. A woman in a white dress, her eyes hollow and her face twisted in agony, just as Eleanor had described. She reached out to me, her mouth opening in a silent scream. I was paralyzed, unable to move or look away. The woman stepped through the mirror, her form becoming solid, tangible. She moved towards me with an otherworldly grace, her feet barely touching the floor. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, my body refusing to obey. She stopped inches from me, her cold hand brushing my cheek. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a mournful wail that echoed in my mind. "Release me." In a flash, I was back in the ballroom, gasping for breath. Mark was shaking me, his face pale with fear. "Dan, what happened? You were screaming." I told him about the woman, the mirror, everything. He listened, his expression shifting from concern to disbelief. "Dan, there's no mirror in that room. I checked earlier." Desperate to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I dragged him upstairs to the locked room. But when we opened the door, it was empty. No mirror, no whispers, just a dusty, unused space. We left the mansion at first light, our spirits subdued by the night's events. Mark tried to rationalize what had happened, but I knew the truth. The woman in the white dress was real, her torment palpable. Her plea for help edged into my soul. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I heard whispers, felt a cold presence in my room. I tried to move on, to forget, but she wouldn't let me. Her image haunted my dreams, her mournful cries echoing in my mind. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I returned to the mansion. I had to know, had to understand what she wanted from me. The place was just as we left it, a decaying monument to forgotten lives. I found the diary again, flipping to the final entry. October 31st, 1902. I can no longer endure the torment. The woman in white is relentless. Her cry is a constant agony. I have decided to end it, to seek peace in death. To whoever finds this diary, beware the mirror. She is trapped within it, and she seeks to escape. I closed the diary with trembling hands. The mirror was real, and so was the woman. She had chosen me for reasons I cannot fathom. And now I had to find a way to release her, or face an eternity of torment. As I stared at the diary, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and turned to see her standing there, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice a dagger in my heart. I knew what I had to do. I would find the mirror, confront whatever dark force held her captive, and set her free. It was the only way to end the nightmare, and to save my sanity. And so, with a sense of grim determination, I set out to face the horrors of the mansion one last time.